Imagine this. Today, we're going to explore one of the most critical what-if questions in history. What if China had never joined Korean War? A brief summary of the Korean War. In 1950, North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union, launched an invasion of South Korea. The goal was clear: to turn the entire Korean peninsula into a communist state. The United States and United Nations forces entered the war to defend South Korea. At first, North Korea advanced rapidly, but with U.S. intervention, the balance of power shifted. Under the leadership of General MacArthur, UN forces launched the Incheon landing, pushing North Korean troops back. Then came the critical moment. UN forces almost completely captured North Korea and advanced all the way to the Chinese border, the Yalu River. And at that exact moment, China stepped onto the stage. Why did China join the war? For China, this war was not just about Korea. It had three major fears: the U.S. Army reaching its borders, the collapse of communist North Korea, the expansion of U.S. power in Asia. Mao Zedong thought, if Korea falls today, China will be next tomorrow. The result? China entered the war with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and the fate of the war changed forever. Alternate history. What if China had never intervened? Now, let's imagine a different timeline. China does not enter the war. It stops at the Yalu River and does not intervene. What would happen? The first major consequence: North Korea would collapse. At that time, the North Korean army was morally devastated, short on manpower, logistically exhausted. U.S. and UN forces would fully capture Pyongyang, and the war would most likely end by the end of 1950. Would Korea have reunified? Yes, most likely. But how? A U.S.-backed reunification, meaning a single Korean state, a capitalist system of government aligned with the United States. The model of today's South Korea would spread across the entire peninsula. In this scenario, North Korea would not exist. The Kim Jong-un dynasty would never emerge. Nuclear crises would never happen. Korea would probably become an economic powerhouse like Japan. How would the Cold War change? China's absence from the war would not only affect Korea, but the entire world. Fire U.S. power would increase. The United States would think, we can stop communism. This would lead the U.S. to adopt a more aggressive policy in Asia. Snowflake, the Soviet Union would weaken. The Soviets would suffer a major loss of prestige in Korea. This could weaken Sino-Soviet relations, create cracks within the communist bloc. The balance of power in Asia would shift. The Vietnam War might start earlier, or perhaps never happen at all. China could remain a more passive global power. Consequences for China. What if China had stayed out of the war? In the short term, it might seem beneficial. Fewer military casualties, no economic burden, direct conflict with the U.S. But in the long term, the risks would be enormous. The U.S. Army would be stationed right at China's border. This would be a serious threat to Beijing. Perhaps the U.S. would fully secure Taiwan, implement a containment policy against China. As a result, China might never become the global power it is today. What would today's world look like? if China had not joined the Korean War. Today's world would be very different. Globe showing Europe, Africa a possible scenario. A unified Korean state, much stronger U.S. influence in Asia, weaker China. As a superpower, no North Korean nuclear weapons, the Korean Peninsula as one of the world's strongest economies. Maybe today, Samsung and Hyundai would not just be South Korean brands, but brands of a united Korea. The big question: would the world be better without China's intervention? This question is extremely complex. Heavy check mark, it would be better for Korea. Heavy check mark, could the world be more stable? Maybe. Cross mark, but the excessive strengthening of the U.S. might trigger new wars. So history does not have a single correct answer. China's intervention may have actually delayed an even bigger global conflict. The most terrifying possibility: a new world war. Ironically, China's absence from the war could have triggered an even larger conflict, because the excessive strengthening of the United States could push the Soviet Union to become more aggressive, increase tensions in Europe, accelerate the nuclear arms race. Perhaps World War III could have begun in the mid-20th century, ending the fate of history. China's entry into the Korean War changed not only Korea's fate, but the fate of the entire world. If China had not intervened, the world we know today would most likely not exist. So what do you think? Would the world be better if China had stayed out of the Korean War, or more dangerous